Hey, what's up, everybody? You know, next month or the end of this month will mark the end. It will mark the end. Excuse me. It'll mark the end of the Shattered World Crisis arc, which initially, let's be honest, began in 252. It began in 252, which was basically the prologue to Countdown to Chaos. And it's been going since 252 to what it's going to be at the end of this month into next month, 287. So together that's about 35 issues. It's almost three years this thing has been going. And excuse me. And it's hard to say exactly why this story arc didn't end when it should have. You know, we take a look at a lot of comic book events, story arcs portrayed in Marvel, IDW, DC, Image, Top Cow, you name it. And usually once in a while you'll have a major event that's going to last almost a year. And usually it is centered around one comic book, well, around one character or several characters in that comic book. But most times it's centered around a big crossover event. And sometimes you use most of the year to build up to said crossover event or to said event itself, and then you close out the year with said event. Countdown to Chaos 252 to 256 did just that. It opened the door to the Shattered World Crisis, but combined with it began a journey for fans like myself that have lasted a long time. Like I said, 1 month short of 3 years. It'll be 35 months, 35 issues, and 1 month short of 3 years. 1 month short. But if you want to look at it, round it out, it's about 36 years. Or even it out, I should say, it's about 30, not 36 years, but 36 issues, about 3 years. So yeah, and I'll be honest, you know, I've read Sonic story arcs before, by Ian Flynn, by Ken Penders, and other artists, other writers, as I should say, and usually they don't last this long. You know, they don't usually last this long. Iron Dominion, we know, lasted for about a year, which I could accept because you were trying to establish a new villainous threat in the absence of Eggman. So you wanted to build that threat up, so I can understand that. I completely get that. So you need the time to do it. But when one looks at it as a whole, when one looks at it, you know, even when Ken Penders did his World Tour arc, from what was it? Issue 50 something, one of the mid 50, around the mid 50 issues, up until about what? Issue 67, 68. You know, that lasted for about a year. And to compensate with it, it had some side stories that took place in Mobotropolis. Either in Knothole or in Mobotropolis. Well, the main story, of course, focused on Sonic and Tails traveling the world after Naugus. So I could understand and I can accept that. You know, there's nothing. I have nothing against that. I can understand and accept that, because when one thinks about it, that too lasted a year. So I can accept. Me and a lot of fans out here can accept 1 year arcs if they're necessary. But Ian Flynn, for some odd reason, some odd, strange reason, I don't know what it was. Obviously, Ian Flynn wanted to do a mega arc. You know, when people talk about Ken Penders, and despite how you feel about the guy, Ken Penders is always going to be synonymous with the Sonic comic for one reason, and that's Endgame. Yeah, he did some other great, decent, not so decent, controversial, you know, what the blank was he thinking kind of stories. But the one arc he'll always be synonymous with is Endgame. And why, you may ask? Because that was his magnum opus. That, despite all the stories that came afterwards, was his magnum opus. That was his story. Even with the whole 125 issue, 125 anniversary issue, that there, Endgame, was his magnum opus. That was his masterpiece. So you can only imagine how Ian Flynn, taking over for the guy as head writer, must have felt when he saw how people, despite how they feel about Ken Penders, has said that Endgame was probably one of the best stories he's done. You know, and that's an opinion of a lot of fans. Not many, but, you know, quite a few, but quite a good amount of fans. So you can only imagine Ian Flynn saying, like, well, if Ken can get a 4-issue arc that concludes in issue 50, in the 50th anniversary issue, maybe I can do something better, something bigger, something grander. And I believe when he did the Mecha Sally arc, that was going to be his magnum opus. I think the whole Mecha Sally, Death Egg Mark II, World Tour 2 story arc, I think, in my opinion, was going to be his magnum opus. I think, in my opinion, he wanted to build up to that moment where Sally gets not only roboticized, but build to the moment where she gets de-roboticized. I think he wanted to make this his magnum opus. And when you listen to what he says, listen to what he said about what he had planned. Even in the first part of the Lost Hitchhik Tales that he finally put out, he basically said that originally, and this comes from other sources as well, he wanted to at least get this up to maybe 300, or at least 2 something, around an anniversary issue where she would be restored and she would have the redesign that we see now. So obviously Ian Flynn has had plans to do a magnum opus, and you would think, okay, he's done the Iron Dominion arc. That was a year-long arc, which, if you add in the side story in Sonic Universe of Journey to the East, is essentially a 16-month arc altogether. And then you look at one of his first mega stories, which was The Darkest Storm. You take a look at his 175 story arc that started in 175 and ended in 177. You take a look at, you know, 198 to 200. You know, you take a look at all these little story arcs, small, large, whatever, and you think, well, he's had an opportunity here and there to do this. You know, he's had all this opportunity to come out and do a magnum opus, a masterpiece, a story that he's going to be remembered by, for the Sonic comic, on more than one occasion. And several of these that I've pointed out, many fans would agree, could actually serve as that magnum opus, that mega event. Like I said, with Darkest Storm, it could serve as it. The 175 to 177 arc could serve as it. You know, the Iron Dominion arc could serve as it. But apparently, in my opinion, and I'm checking my time here, 10 minutes in my opinion, I think he wanted something grander. I think he wanted to have a story arc that not only was bigger, story lengthwise, but he wanted something that he wanted to do a story that no matter who came after him, he believes no one can top. And like I said, when it came to the Mecha Sally arc, I think that was his original plan. But because of behind the scenes issues, legal issues that is, that didn't come to pass. Thus he had to do a soft retcon reboot of the comic to kind of contain what was left over within this new continuity, and that the only acknowledgement and reference and nod to said past continuity, past timeline, pre-soft reboot, was the Deus Ex Machina of Nicole being the key, as I mentioned at one time, of restoring everybody's memories. Well, with the exception of Knuckles and a few in the Chaotix, she had restored everybody else's memories. So, with that said, obviously Ian knew he had to come up with something to make up for his original plans going down the toilet. So I think that's where this whole near 3-year arc came in. I think that's where this comes in. The fact that he saw something to start out with Countdown to Chaos, and figured, you know what, I can build upon this and finally get my magnum opus that I wanted to get with the Mecha Sally arc. And that's what he's done. Despite how we feel about how long it's been going. Despite some of us looking at some of the filler arcs in the universe, and even some of the mini sub arcs or subplots in the main comic. This is basically what he's been wanting. He's been wanting to do this magnum opus of an event, of a story arc, so that, like I said, in my opinion, he can go out and say that not only did he create and publish in a bigger, longer, more memorable story than what Ken Penders did with Endgame, but like I said, I think he wanted something to be remembered by, so that if he ever does decide to step away from the comic and give somebody else the chance of being head writer, then nobody in his mind will be able to touch what he's done. And initially, it's a story that people will remember him by. And maybe in his mind, will remember him more so than they remember Ken Penders. Ken Penders for doing Endgame. That's just my opinion. I think that's why this lasted as long. Because despite the interruptions, despite, the Worlds Unite sequel to Worlds Collide, the Mega Man Sonic crossover sequel, Worlds Unite, which this time had a bigger cast, had all the characters not involved in the last crossover, and even included several Capcom and Sega characters from other Capcom and Sega games, like Street Fighter, Kid Alex, you name it. Emoji, that spirit wolf, whatever its name is, Amaji, whatever, that spirit wolf. Again, I think he, despite that, even trying to add that texture, if you will, of that crossover happening, adding a bit of it into the continuity to what only Sonic remembers, and even Eggman remembers. Despite all that, he's had numerous opportunities to end this arc a lot sooner than usual. And I think a lot of fans look at that like, Ian, you've had time and time to end this. Why haven't you? Now, some will agree and talk and mention what I've talked about and mentioned, and that is earlier, late at the end, towards the end of last year and beginning of this year, Archie Comics had a bit of a problem behind the scenes. Wasn't legal or anything. It was more of a printing issue, as well as they were moving offices. They were moving themselves from from one building, from one location to another. So that caused a delay, not just in the Sonic comics, but in the other primary comics. So with that said, you take a look, at all that, and even with those distractions here and there, and even if you want to take out the 4 issues of the main comic that dealt with the crossover, you're looking at a near 2.5 to near 3 year story arc that, like I said, a lot of people probably would agree he could have ended at any time. But the reason he didn't is because I believe, in my opinion, he wanted to create his own magnum opus. He wanted to create his own story arc that nobody could touch, his own masterpiece. The one story that, like I said, whenever he decides to step down from the comic, whenever he decides to do that, people will remember him by. In his mind, when people mention Ian Flynn's run with Archie, they'll say, oh, in his mind, he's believing, in my opinion, he's believing when people talk about his run with the Archie comics, they'll be like, oh yeah, I know who you're talking about, the guy that did that near 3 year Shattered Worlds Crisis arc in the Sonic comic, or in the Sonic comics when Archie was publishing them, or when he was part of Archie. He's the one that did that 3 year Sonic arc called what? Shattered World Crisis, dealt with that werehog situation, whatever. That's what he's hoping for. That's what he's hoping for, in my opinion. Because that's how people look at Ken Penders. Despite how we feel about him with the Laurel Sue Chronicles. Despite how we feel about him causing trouble, which made the soft retcon reboot reality because of his behind-the-scenes legal battles. The one thing people remember him by, the one story arc that people associate him with most of during his run with the Sonic comics, is Endgame. And I think that's what Ian Flynn is doing here. Ian Flynn wants a story arc that people will remember him by. They will talk about when he's done with the comic. And like I said, go on to probably say, oh yeah, probably go on to ask somebody, hey, you know who Ian Flynn is? And hopefully, and like I said, in my opinion, in his mind, hopefully they'll be like, oh yeah, he's the guy that did that near 3 year long Sonic, 3 year long story arc for the Sonic comic book when Archie was publishing it, or the Sonic comic book that Archie's currently publishing. So I think that's why he's doing it, or has done this. I think that's why the whole Shadow World Crisis, Countdown to Chaos, the sub-arcs, the subplots, even throw in the 4-part issues for the Worlds Unite crossover sequel. And I think that's why Ian Flynn, has stretched the story out as long as he has, because he wants this to be his magnum opus. He wants this to be the story arc people remember him by, people acknowledge him by, and people will give him praise for. Despite the fact in a lot of people's eyes he could have ended this a long time ago. So if you want to know why the Sonic story arc in Archie Comics Shadow World Crisis has lasted so long, hopefully, in my opinion, I've given you the answer. So let me know what you guys think down below.